Hello, good morning, everyone. Am I audible? Oh, sorry. Okay, so again, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. So, today's webinar focuses on something we encounter every day online. That's how content captures attention and influences people to respond. So, every single day, people consume massive amounts of content, from social media posts and advertisements to videos, emails, and articles. Audiences are constantly exposed to information. But despite the volume of content online, only a small percentage actually captures attention, creates engagement, and influences people to respond. So the question is, why do some content pieces instantly make people stop scrolling, click, comment, or even purchase, while others get completely ignored? The answer often lies in psychology. So, welcome to our webinar, and let's explore how human behavior, emotion, and decision making affect the way people interact with content, and how we can use those insights to create more effective communication. So, before we begin, let's take a look at our table of contents, or our webinar roadmap. So today's discussion will focus on how psychology influences audience behavior online, from capturing attention to maintaining engagement and eventually encouraging action. But before we dive into the main discussion, let's begin with a quick experiment. It's called Which One Would You Click? So again, before we officially begin, I'd like everyone to participate in a quick content experiment. We have 3 questions for our participants, and you can share your answers in the comment section. I'll wait. So again, don't overthink your answers and simply choose the option that naturally catches your attention. Let's start. Are you ready? Let's start. Okay. So if you were scrolling online and saw these two headlines, which one would you most likely click? We have option A and option B. Let's see your answers in the comment section. That's right. B, most people, just like you, would usually choose option B. Why? Because it creates curiosity. It identifies problem and promises a solution. So let's proceed to our second experiment. Let's try another one. Which post feels more engaging or attention grabbing? We have post A says our webinar starts tomorrow at 8 a.m. and post B says most content gets ignored in seconds. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., learn why some content grabs attention instantly while others get skipped. You can comment post A or post B. That's right. Many audiences are naturally drawn towards option B because it creates emotional interest and raises curiosity. Instead of only providing information, it creates an anticipation and relevance. Are we ready for the final experiment, for the last experiment? Okay, let's compare these two calls to action. CTA A says learn more and B says discover what makes content impossible to ignore. B is the obvious answer. Even though both encourage engagement, the second CTA feels more compelling because it creates curiosity, communicates value, and emotionally connects to the audience's interest. Instead of simply asking audiences to click, learn more, instead, it gives them a reason to care. So, uh, did any one of you participate? I hope yes. Let's see in the comment section. Okay. So, now that we're done with our um, short content experiment, you might be wondering, why do certain headlines, posts, or calls to action naturally feel more compelling than others? So, in many cases, audiences respond because content psychologically captures their attention before they even fully realize it. Excuse me. Perfect. Okay, where were we? So here's something interesting. In digital spaces, people often decide within seconds whether content is worth their attention. This means creators Marketers and communicators are not simply competing with other content. They're competing against distraction itself. And this is exactly where content psychology becomes important. So, what is content psychology? According to paperballad.com, content psychology studies how people think, feel, and respond to content. By understanding emotions and behavior, creators can craft messages that increase engagement and drive action. So, content psychology focuses on understanding how people think, feel, and behave when consuming content. It explores why certain posts, videos, advertisements, or messages immediately attract attention while others fail to connect with audiences. One important thing to understand is people do not always respond to content because it contains information. More often, they respond because something emotionally or psychologically triggers them. For example, people click, let's see, people click because they are curious. People engage because they relate emotionally. People trust content that feels authentic, and people take action when content creates motivation or urgency. In other words, successful content is not only creative, it is psychologically effective. So let's discuss these four drives, why people respond to content. So people click because they are curious. First is curiosity. People naturally want answers, explanations, or missing information. Second is emotion. Content that creates emotional impact is often more memorable and shareable. Third is relatability. Audiences engage more with content that reflects their experiences, struggles, or even their interests. Trust is also a major role. People respond more positively to content that feels authentic and credible. Simplicity matters as well because audiences prefer content that is easy to understand and process quickly. Humans are naturally influenced by what other people like, support, or recommend. So these psychological factors strongly affect how audiences react online, even without realizing it. So now that we have discussed how psychology influences audience behavior, the next question becomes, how exactly does content guide people from simply noticing something to actually responding to it? In most cases, audience interaction does not happen instantly. Instead, people move through a psychological process. First, content needs to capture attention. Then it must maintain engagement and emotional connection. And finally, it should encourage audiences to take action. This process is what we call the content response journey. And throughout the next few sections, we'll break down each stage and explore the psychological principles behind them. So, the first challenge of content is very simple: getting people to stop scrolling. In digital spaces, attention is extremely limited. Audiences are constantly distracted, so content has only a few seconds, sometimes even less, to make an impact. So curiosity creates attention. One of the strongest psychological techniques used in content is called the curiosity gap. The curiosity gap happens when content gives audiences incomplete information, making them naturally want to know more. Human brains are naturally uncomfortable with missing information. When people feel there is a gap between what they currently know and what they want to know, curiosity is triggered. And once curiosity is activated, audiences become more likely to click, continue reading, or engage further. For example, the first example says, "You're making this mistake without realizing it." This statement alone immediately creates psychological tension because people begin asking themselves, what mistake? Am I doing it too? Or how do I fix it? Another example says, "Here's why your content isn't converting." Instead of giving complete information immediately, the statement creates a knowledge gap that audiences naturally want to close. This is why curiosity-based headlines are commonly used in marketing, social media, video thumbnails, and advertising. However, it's also important to use curiosity responsibly. If the content creates curiosity but fails to deliver meaningful value afterward, audiences may lose trust. Effective content captures curiosity, but it also satisfies it. Next is emotion makes content memorable. So another factor that influences at audience attention is emotion. In many situations, audiences may forget specific details, but they often remember how content made them feel. And there are several emotions that commonly influence engagement online. Sorry. First is excitement. Second is excitement. Let's discuss excitement. Content that creates anticipation, inspiration, or enthusiasm tends to generate stronger audience interest. Second is surprise. Human intent. Third is empathy. And lastly is urgency. So ultimately, emotion is powerful because it transforms content from something audiences simply see into something, emotion is powerful because it transforms content from something that the audiences just wanted to see, but it also turns into something they genuinely want to feel. So at this point, we already understand how content captures attention. Curiosity makes people pause, and emotion makes people notice and remember something. But capturing attention alone does not guarantee meaningful engagement because even if the audience has stopped scrolling for a moment, the next challenge becomes, how do we keep them interested? This brings us to the second stage of content response journey. That is maintaining engagement. Attention gets people in. Engagement keeps them there. But once content successfully captures attention, audiences begin deciding whether the content is worth continuing. This is where relatability, clarity, emotional connection, and trust become more extremely important because people stay engaged with content that feels relevant, human, and easy to understand. So let's talk about relatability and simplicity. One of the strongest ways to maintain engagement is relatability. Audiences naturally connect with content that reflects their experiences, emotions, and personal interests. Relatable content creates a stronger emotional connection and engagement. So when audiences see themselves in the content, they are more likely to continue watching, reading, or even listening. The second factor is simplicity. Clear and easy to understand content helps audiences process information faster. Simplicity reduces mental effort and improves audience retention. Sometimes, creators focus too much on sounding highly technical or overly complex. But in reality, audiences often engage with content with that feels clear, direct, and easy to process. Simple communication reduces mental effort, And when content feels easier to understand, audiences are more likely to stay engaged. But relatability and simplicity alone are still not enough. Let's remember that. Audiences also need to feel that the content and the person behind it is genuine. Because in today's digital environment, audiences have become highly sensitive to authenticity. So let's talk about authenticity builds trust. Modern audiences are more likely to engage with content that feels honest, natural, and human rather than overly scripted or promotional. Authentic communication helps build credibility, emotional connection, and long term audience trust. And when audiences constantly perceive content as authentic, trust naturally begins to develop. This is important because trust strongly influences whether audiences continue engaging, return to future content, or eventually take action. In many cases, authenticity creates stronger audience connection than perfection. So far, we have explored how content captures attention and maintains engagement. But ultimately, most content is created with a purpose. Whether the goal is participation, engagement, conversion, sign-ups, or response, effective content should eventually encourage audiences to take action. And this brings us to the final stage of the content response journey, driving action. Action happens when emotion, clarity, and motivation align. At this stage, the goal is no longer just gaining attention or maintaining interest. The goal now is guiding audiences toward a decision or response. But before audiences take action, there's one important challenge we first need to understand, and that is distraction. Today's audiences are constantly surrounded by content, notifications, advertisements, and information that competes for their attention. And because of this, many people go through different psychological stages of distraction before deciding whether to engage or ignore content. Let's talk about them. So we have four phases of distraction. The first phase is information overload. Audiences are exposed to excessive content every day. So daily, audiences consume massive amounts of content across different platforms. Because people are so exposed to many information, attention naturally becomes selective. This makes it more difficult for content to stand out unless it immediately feels relevant, emotionally engaging, and valuable. The second phase is a short attention span. Online audiences make decisions very quickly. If content feels too slow, confusing, or uninteresting, people move on almost immediately. This is why strong hooks, visuals, and emotional triggers are extremely important in digital communication. The third phase is emotional disconnection. Audiences tend to ignore content that feels too generic, robotic, or emotionally flat. People engage more deeply with content that feels human, content that are relatable and emotionally meaningful. Without emotional connection, attention becomes difficult to sustain. And the last phase is decision fatigue. When audiences are given too many choices, too much information, or unclear direction, they become less likely to respond. Too much complexity often creates hesitation instead of action. This is why effective content should guide audiences clearly and simply towards the next step. So once content successfully overcomes these distractions and maintains audience attention, the next challenge becomes guiding people toward action. And one of the most powerful tools for doing that is the call to action. Calls to action or CTAs are important because they guide audiences toward what to do next. But not all CTAs create the same level of response. Some feel a bit generic and easy to ignore, while others create curiosity, clarity, and emotional motivation. For example, we have a comparison here of two CTAs. One is a weak CTA, while the other one is a strong CTA. Weak CTA says click here, and the stronger CTA says start creating content that audiences remember. The second CTA feels more compelling because it creates curiosity and it gives audiences a clearer emotional reason to engage. Effective CTAs do more than provide instruction. Let's take note of that. They communicate value. So, now that we have explored the psychological factors behind attention, engagement, and action, the next question is how can we actually apply these principles in real world content creation? So let's talk about applying content psychology um, in real world content creation. Psychological principles can be applied across different platforms and industries to create more effective and impactful content. In social media, creators use curiosity and emotional triggers to increase engagement. In marketing, business use trust, storytelling, and conversion. They use this to influence customer decisions. While in branding, consistency, relatability, and identity helps strengthen audience connection. Even in presentations, business communications, and content creations, um, for example, webinars like this, psychological principles help keep audiences attentive and engaged. So ultimately, effective content is not simply about aesthetics or visibility. It's all about understanding how people think, feel, and respond. To simplify everything, okay, so do you have questions or clarifications? You can share your concerns in the comment section if you have some. Okay, I'll let you digest everything we have discussed so far before we simplify everything. Okay, so again, to simplify everything we discussed today, we can summarize effective content psychology into a one simple framework. Let's see. So take note of this: hook, emotion, value, and action. First is the hook. This captures audience attention and encourages people to stop scrolling. Second is emotion. Emotion creates connection and makes content more memorable. Then value. Once attention is captured, content must provide something useful, relevant, or meaningful. Finally, action. Effective content should guide audiences toward a response or decision. Hook, emotion, value, and action. These four elements work together to create psychologically effective content. So, that summarizes everything, right? We just need to hook our audiences, give them the right emotions, offer them value, and let them do the action. So before we conclude, let's quickly revisit the key ideas from our today's discussion. So here are our key takeaways. First, attention is psychological. People notice content that creates curiosity, emotional relevance, or interruption. Second, engagement is emotional. Audiences stay connected to content that feels relatable, authentic, and meaningful. And finally, action is intentional. People are more likely to respond when content clearly motivates and guides them towards a decision. So, understanding these psychological principles helps creators communicate more effectively in today's highly competitive environment. So that's it. No, um, at the end of the day, successful content is not only about creativity; it's about human connection. The more we understand audience behavior, emotion, and